All right, hello, welcome to this video on the culture in Europe of the 1800s. So we're going to look at some of the cultural trends that we saw kind of start, during the time of the French Revolution, Napoleonic era. We're going to see how those changed and continued throughout the 1800s and what new cultural trends kind of pop up. We're going to look at music and art and writing and literature and things like that. So let's take a look at this. We'll also kind of look at this in class too. We're going to look at some examples and some video clips and things like that too. But this is just mostly to get the information down. All right. So last, maybe 2 units ago, honestly, we looked at Romanticism. The Romantic movement, the movement of Romanticism, is kind of highly tied to nationalism. This was a trend we see as a kind of a reaction to the Enlightenment, to the Industrial Revolution, to the Scientific Revolution, all those forward pushing kind of intellectual movements. Romanticism in general is tied to nationalism, and it's tied to kind of the past and a yearning for the past. It's tied to nature and national ideas and trends and going back into nature and to the olden times before society became corrupted. Similar to what people kind of associate with Jean-Jacques Rousseau of the French Enlightenment, but Romanticism in general is again tied to these national, mythical kind of nature-based things, and the Romantic artists that we see kind of in the 1800s really kind of go along with this same trend. So again, they're anti-enlightenment, anti-logic, anti-science and technology and industrialization, and kind of pro-history, pro-nationalism, pro-nature, pro-state of nature, and things like that. I've listed here just a bunch of different, mostly music artists here that you might want to know. Tchaikovsky, for example, a Russian composer, very famous for writing music that kind of celebrated national trends in history, such as the 1812 Overture that celebrated Russia defeating France in the Napoleonic Wars. Famous songs from him include like the Nutcracker songs and Swan Lake and things like that. I believe that was also by him. You have Wagner, the anti-Semitic composer from German lands, kind of composing Nordic and Germanic songs that kind of support those trends and histories coming out of Central and Northern Europe and things like that. Again, we've talked about Romanticism before. I just kind of want to make sure you're still familiar with them. And again, like I said, you see national fairy tales and myths kind of develop from Goethe, the German writer, but also from the Brothers Grimm, from that same part of Europe. Those are also romantic because, again, they kind of help people develop a national mythology and identity across Europe. And so you can differentiate, French stories from German stories, from Czech stories and things like that. All right, these might play. Let's skip through them. All right. Okay, next artistic movement is Realism. Realism is heavily affiliated with the rise of industrialization and urbanization in Europe. We kind of see that trend kind of grow as the Industrial Revolution grows. It grows throughout the 1800s and into the early 1900s, into the World War era when it kind of disappears. But realism is what it sounds like. Realist literature and art tried to show the world as it was. Again, it's very highly tied to urbanization, industrialization, but it tried to show the world as it was, usually in a negative light, saying that the world's not that great. There's lots of bad stuff happening out there. They try to take, a picture of the world as it was in its grim reality without trying to sugarcoat or to make things look nice. The literature we're looking at here, they mostly were targeted towards bourgeois women, middle class women that were free to live at home and work at home, or maybe take care of the kids at home. And you see stories listed here that kind of just show women getting into trouble and having these affairs and these issues that happen that kind of pop up and make things kind of tough for them. Leading to usually dramatic incidences, such as in the case of Madame Bovary here, where there's a suicide at the end. We see Charles Dickens. He is a very famous realistic writer. Oliver Twist and A Tale of Two Cities. Those works kind of again paint a grim story of what London was like in this in this period with like street urchins and like orphans and things like that, and people just having a tough life living in these new industrial cities. So tough that they kind of came up with the adjective Dickensian to describe works that were so pessimistic and downtrodden. Moving on to art of the realistic movement, again, showing people working, living in their life without trying to sugarcoat anything. The gleaners, I've talked about gleaning, the old practice that's going away as Europe gets away from its rural heritage and it goes into an industrial direction. Gleaning is being depicted here, where you can pick up the scraps left on the field after the field is harvested, so you can feed your family with them if you want, or sell them, whatever you want. Probably just feed your family, not enough to really sell. But realistic art again shows workers and people living in a realistic setting, or going to work on second class, third class, fourth class on a train or whatever. Again, showing things as they were. Here you see two women resting on the banks of the Seine River in Paris. Maybe a hint that they might be prostitutes. Who can say? I believe they are not, but that's a common misconception with this piece. There's no actual evidence that these are prostitutes there. But again, there's tons of realistic art from this period that shows things as it was, and there were high rates of prostitution in many of the cities across Europe. More realistic art here, again, not trying to sugarcoat anything, showing people working, living their daily life, usually members of the lower class, of the working class. You might be surprised then to hear, as this becomes a bigger and bigger trend, that people of the members of the bourgeoisie and the upper classes disliked realistic art. It was too low class, it was too beneath them. So we don't really see many upper class people really big fans of these pieces of art and art from this genre of European art from this period. But again, as the Industrial Revolution grows, we see realistic art grow, and people kind of copy it and try to go in that direction. The next stage of realistic art, and this, again, we see this in literature, but also in some pieces of art as well, some visual art, naturalism. You don't really have to know the term naturalism, but just know that realistic art or realism continued to go in a more darker, pessimistic direction. Very famous writer Émile Zola. We're going to talk about him in multiple ways. Very important contributor to France in this period in multiple ways. He wrote about a series of books and articles throughout his career, but one of the things he's best known for is writing a book called Germinal, which we're going to watch a part of in class. It is a story of French coal miners who try to improve their living and working condition by going on a strike, and just how brutal and horrific the repression against them is. We'll look at pieces of that in class. There's a movie made about it if you have the time to watch it. It's kind of long and in French, but it is interesting. I enjoyed it. But it just shows you just how, through his writing, he shows you just how dark and depressing things were. A famous story happens in this book, Germinal. Émile Zola goes to different parts of France, and he actually goes into the coal mines to see how these coal miners lived and worked. Because again, according to realism, you want to portray things as accurately as you can. You don't want to sugarcoat anything. It's almost like a scientific type of writing, trying not to, make anything up. He goes to this coal mine, and he goes underground, and he sees all the coal miners mining down there. But he actually sees a giant horse down there, a big horse pushing and pulling carts down there. He asks the coal miners, how do you get this horse out above ground and below ground each day? Isn't that a lot of work? Doesn't that freak out the horse? Like, what do you do? And the coal miner just kind of laughs at him and says, well, we bring the horse down when the horse is a young colt, when it's a baby horse, and we just leave him down here. And then he dies when he dies. We bring another horse down after that. So again, kind of shocking the conscious and what people kind of knew or what was going on in these working class situations throughout Europe. These realists were really kind of famous for that. So Émile Zola, very important realist. You have Tolstoy, another one. He wrote about what was going on in Russia, particularly under the reforms of Tsar Alexander II, who we'll talk about soon. And then you have Crime and Punishment from Dostoevsky. He wrote about a guy dealing with the all of the implications of committing a crime, then the fallout from committing a crime, and what happens after that. But we do see realists really try to be as accurate as possible and not sugarcoat anything as possible and just show the world as it was. And as we get into this naturalist stage, they get more pessimistic. That's one of the big differences between early and later realism, that these later realists are just much more dark and depressing. Because again, they saw some dark and depressing things as they, you know, gathered materials for their writing. As we get past the industrial era and go into, well, I guess we're never going to get past the industrial era, but as we move further into the industrial era to closer to the 20th century, we're going to see modern art develop. And there's one really big important ballet we're going to look at in class called The Rites of Spring. Rites of Spring was a very shocking ballet. We're going to look at this in class, so I will not really talk too much about this here. But modern art in general and modern music in general really shocked the system. And as we saw science moving away from certain principles based on the work of Isaac Newton and the scientists of the scientific revolution, as they go into more abstract and uncertain territory, you know, talking about things like the uncertainty principle, art actually kind of mimics that. Art goes in a very similar direction. We see art kind of move away from what's certain and what's real into this place that is really just uncertain and unfamiliar. Looking at examples, we have kind of three examples here that we're going to look at before we end this. We have Impressionism, Cubism, and then abstract art. These are examples of modern art that really begin to really kind of shock the system a little bit. Looking at art prior to modern art, art before modern art was really based on the real world. You try to paint people and objects and situations that actually could happen, whether they were, like based on mythology or a fairy tale or what you saw in a factory. You try to portray things in a natural, realistic way. That's been true more or less since the Renaissance. However, with modern art, we start to see artists move away from that. Let's look at some examples. The first example is Impressionism. Impressionists, they make art that kind of is based on the way that they kind of imagine light hitting objects and people. So when you see Impressionist art, you might notice that the way that people's faces shine or that light hits people's faces or objects, such as in any of these paintings here, honestly, that's really the key hallmark of Impressionism. Again, the impression that light makes when it hits an object. And again, you still kind of see human shapes and figures and realistic sizes and things like that, but you're going to really notice that light is a really important factor in these pieces here, such as in this piece here when you see the setting sun kind of hit the bay there. All right, post-impressionism is kind of getting further away from that realistic thing, and the big guy here is Vincent van Gogh, who I'm sure you know. Vincent van Gogh is a really big post-impressionist, the post-impressionist arguably. Again, light is still an important and a piece of a lot of his paintings. Even in the self-portrait here, the light hitting his forehead is important, and of course it's important in this Field of Crows and Starry Night. But again, things are getting more abstract and less realistic with these post-impressionists. All right. Another example of post-impressionism here. Again, still very realistic, but getting more and more abstract. Then we get to Cubism. We can still barely see some human figures in this painting here, the Women of Avignon, but we don't really see very realistic things going on. We don't really see very human-like shapes. It's cubist, and you see kind of animal or mask-like shapes there as well. So again, it's getting more and more abstract and less based on reality when we get to Cubism. Cubism, the definition basically is that it was an art form that's based on geometric shapes and forcing geometric shapes and kind of making figures and people and objects out of those geometric shapes and figures, breaking things down from their human-like major concepts into these bare geometric figures in the basics, if you will. All right. So the last piece here, the last movement is abstract art, in which you kind of break things down even more. Cubism, again, you're breaking things down into the shapes to what they resemble. In abstract art, you're just kind of focusing on basic colors and situations. So this is the piece right here, Kazimir Malovich's Black Square. published in 1923, just a black square. And you see this trend kind of continue today. So just as I said in the last lecture, we saw science really kind of moving from these certain dominant principles based around the works of Isaac Newton and the other scientists of the scientific revolution. Art is also kind of going in a similar direction, where we saw the science of the scientific revolution kind of be changed into these abstract, uncertain principles. Art is kind of going in that same direction, where the chaos of the World War era and all those things are kind of combined and just kind of destroy people's reality and make them kind of have to, deal with that destruction and uncertainty that the world's going through and deal with that through art. And that's kind of what we see in these impressionist, cubist, and abstract artists of the modern era. All right, so we'll look at some a little bit more of these examples in class, specifically modern music and ballet. But yeah, that's kind of it for today. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.